And we should be live. Hey YouTube, welcome to my channel. I'm Benedict the 17th, and with me today is Settler's Lament. Sorry for the brief delay. And we should be live. And it sounds like we're getting some feedback. So I'm gonna figure out what to do with that in order to try get it so we can both be heard. Excuse us for a brief second. And can Settler, if you'd like to introduce yourself, that way we can test to see if they can hear both of us.
Okay.
Welcome to my channel. I'm Benedict this in order to try get it so we So with the settler concept, how does that relate to Canada? Just as a set. Okay, that makes sense. Uh, okay, so we we started talking backstage, and uh, really what we were talking about on Twitter was kind of this idea that liberalism, whether it's nice in concept or whatever, seems to have some serious issues. The issues really seem to be based around uh, whether liberalism in abstract theory overextends itself. In other words, what does it mean to be liberal? You pointed out that different liberals throughout time have had different conceptions of what it means to be liberal. And then there's the issue of degeneracy, if you will. How is it that liberal states seem to always slide downwards? Does that encapsulate your concerns, and how would you elaborate on that? Hey, I don't know if you can hear me, but I suddenly can't hear you. Um, it's on my end because you suddenly started talking and I. Can you hear me, Duke? And can you hear Settler? Hey, can you try talking, Settler?
Yeah. Can anyone in the chat hear me?
Okay, I can hear you now. I just had to disable something on Discord. Um,
Okay. Can the chat hear me?
can you try talking? Hey, can you try talking, Settler?
Yeah. Can anyone in the chat? There's feedback coming through your mic again.
Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay. Can the chat hear me?
Can you try talking? Hey, King Settler?
Yeah. Can anyone in the chat? There's feedback coming through.
Yeah. Okay. It seems like they can hear us, so let's continue. Sorry for the, you know, software issues, but honestly, YouTube changed the things with encoders, so I lost the encoder that I was using and had to learn how to update a new one and start streaming with it within like 20 minutes. So sorry for the big delay. Settler, if you can kind of start from kind of where you were before the new issues happen.
Yeah, of course. I'll start from the beginning. I'm not sure if you guys heard anything I said. But yeah, my issue with liberalism is it doesn't really have anything to do with any specific policy. Um, it's more the focus on liberty itself. The idea that that you should identify as a liberal, put liberty as your highest value, um, because or your highest political value at least. It kind of comes back to what I believe is a Chesterton quote, that heresy isn't the absence of virtue, but it's the focus on one virtue to the exclusion of all others. Um, where the issue with liberalism uh, being that a hyper focus on liberty will, I believe, possibly inherently cause other problems in society.
Okay. Um. So for me, liberty isn't a virtue. It's what makes virtues possible. Um, the basic idea is, and I'm pulling from Douglas Rasmussen here. I've mentioned him before on this channel, but I think the basic thing to understand is um, all virtues require some sense that they've been chosen. Um, in order to be courageous, like it's a matter of will. you can't be forced into courage, into chastity, into perseverance, into temperance, into love, really. And what it comes down to is what liberalism tries to do is to privilege that self determination of human beings. And in doing so, it it does open up, I think, challenges that we're going to get into and that you mentioned on Twitter. But I guess my question is, do we have? I guess when we talk about virtue, what do you mean? What do we mean by virtue? Um, are we kind of talking in the classical Catholic Aristotelian Thomistic sense?
Uh, yeah, I mean, basically, I am Catholic too. Um, though, though what I was saying before, I didn't really mean to say that liberty was a virtue. I just meant that it's analogous to that Chesterton quote. That liberty can. My point is that liberty can be a good thing, but I think focusing on liberty too much can be a problem. Didn't really have anything to do with specifically um, with whether or not liberty itself was a virtue.
Okay. Um, it it's kind of weird because I feel like I want to take a defensive posture, but in order to do that, I need to reintroduce kind of the idea that kind of what you brought up in our chat, which was that you specifically talked about how the Overton window seems to have shifted in liberalism, where you know the liberals of the 1800s seem to be very well. I mean, how did you phrase it on Twitter?
Yeah, well, just I mean, uh, liberals in the 1800s would be slightly to the right of like neo Nazis today, basically. Um, and I mean, I don't think you would have found a single liberal that would have opposed anti-sodomy laws in 18th century England, for example. And I mean, I don't care about anti-sodomy laws, but I just think it's quite interesting how that Overton window has shifted so much.
Mm-hmm.
Where today, even I mean, I don't even know many just hardcore conservatives that would support something like that. Where 100 years ago, that would have just been considered obvious among everyone.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a certain sense that liberalism allows for that. In a way, that if you have kind of a hard conception of, I guess the response I have is kind of to take a distributist view of it and to say that different there is a certain sense that in different cultures there are certain laws, and cultures, I mean, has taken a negative connotation, where the idea is, well, vice can be tolerated in different cultures. So do vices become virtues in different cultures? I don't think that's what I'm trying to get at here. What I mean is that at the local level, certain laws can be better, uh, more tolerated, that aren't violations of rights. Rights should be understood as kind of the very basic foundation of kind of the legal political order, and that's something that if, at the national level, should guide uh, politics. At the local levels, I think you can have a wider variety of laws that are directed towards the common good. The thing with sodomy laws that I have the issue is, it's not like we're protecting the freedom to commit sodomy. Obviously, we're both Catholics. We understand that sodomy is wrong. However, there is a certain sense that in order to prohibit sodomy, we actually have to consider what the political legal order would be doing. right? Um, like, how would you actually do that? You It would be increased surveillance. It would be increased. Um, it wouldn't be just you prohibit the act itself. The way you actually police it would have to be done in a certain way, and that would create, I think, a certain violation of people's privacy rights. And it's those rights that we're protecting, not that there's a right to commit sodomy, but that there's a certain right to privacy. And in order to respect that right, you have to protect sodomy. Does that make sense?
Can I step in here?
Yeah.
Or okay. Yeah. Well, again, I mean, I don't like I don't support sodomy laws or anything. I don't have any particularly strong desire to try and bring them back or anything like that. But there is still a principle here that I think is interesting. And I mean, though on the topic of enforcement, I think that's there's a big difference between having a law and how exactly that law is enforced. Because I mean, the United States had sodomy laws on the books and enforced until 2003, when Lawrence v. Texas struck that down. But there wasn't like the surveillance state, which of course was much more in its infancy back then. But the surveillance state wasn't like going around like listening to people's phone calls or something to find out who was committing sodomy. It was pretty rarely enforced when those laws were in place, at least during that period. Immediately prior to 2003. The case that got rid of it was Lawrence v. Texas, and the reason why that man went to jail for committing sodomy was because his neighbor knew what he was doing, and his neighbor filed a false police report claiming there was a burglary happening when he was really having sex with a man. So it wasn't like the police were like roaming the streets looking for people committing sodomy or listening to calls or something like that. It was just a nosy neighbor doing something which the neighbor also went to jail for. They all got like 2 weeks or something like that, and then went to the Supreme Court and got the sodomy laws overturned. So no, I mean, I certainly would not support any sort of like mass surveillance state to try and figure out who exactly is doing what to whose anus. That but we do have real world examples where these laws did exist not that long ago, and it didn't mean anything quite like that. And again, I don't have any particular desire to go back to that time, or to those laws. But I feel like having those laws does not necessarily mean that those laws would have to be enforced 100%. There's plenty of laws we have that aren't enforced very much. Just like how we have IP laws that protect a lot of IP, but the vast majority of people that commit piracy don't get punished for it because it would just be too burdenous on the state to try and punish everyone. Similarly, if we did have laws like that, or laws against producing pornography, or laws against or something like, if we say we had, that is something I would support, laws against producing pornography. We're not going to send every person that sends a nude to their girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever to jail, even if we did have laws like that, even if that would cover under the law.
Yeah, for me, it wouldn't be the producing of pornography, because again, that gets you into the issues of how do you police it, and two, what do you count as pornography?
The Catechism does specifically say that the church teaches that the production and distribution should be illegal.
I think the way you get around a lot of the issues is you make the profiteering off it illegal. So yeah, you, in a sense, you're allowing for people to send nude pics if they want to, but you crack down on the people who use it for advertising, or the people who actually monetize the porn itself.
Well, I mean, on that, because that is a topic I do actually support these types of laws. So I suppose I can go into that a bit more. My main concern with pornography isn't really the profiteering. I mean, that is bad. But my main concern with pornography is that, like, all boys from the age of 6, it seems, have access to virtually unlimited amounts of pornography. I know us in these circles are quite wary, for good reasons, of internet censorship. But I would like some sort of internet censorship that could keep pornography out of the hands of young boys. And I know that, I mean, yes, good parenting, you can mostly prevent that if you're a good parent. But I mean, I care about the kids who have bad parents too. And the current status quo in pornography, I think, is literally mass sexual abuse of our children. It would, to any people prior to modernity, the idea of just like leaving stacks of pornography out there for any child to come across and view completely unrestricted would have been considered completely absurd, which is essentially what we have now with the internet.
No, I mean I agree with the idea that the extent of pornography, the way it's pervaded our culture, is definitely sexual abuse. I guess really what we're talking here is a difference in our conception of what the government exists to do. Um, I for me, yeah, there is a certain. I mean, the government is directed towards the common good of the people, but the tools the government has to do that are by nature very blunt. And so those blunt tools, essentially the use of force, best exemplified by the police force, are best used, really to tackle violations of rights, um, and certain other crimes that, while not violations of rights itself, violate principles of humanity that are necessary for rights to exist in the first place. Um, which is why I would think that banning profiteering off porn it would be allowable in a liberal state. Um, what I find many traditionalists, and it sounds like you yourself have, is a conception of the state where the state has a duty to represent moral goodness, in a sense. We have laws on the books, not necessarily to tell us what's good and what's bad, but also to like represent, as a culture, as a people, we declare this good or bad. And I'm not sure that's the purpose of government. Is that kind of where you? I don't know. Have I put words in your mouth, or?
No, I mean, I don't think that's totally inaccurate. I suppose, for example, I'm not saying I necessarily would support laws like this, but I wouldn't necessarily be against laws that would ban sex outside of marriage. And the reason I think I could see value in that isn't that I wouldn't want like people having sex outside of marriage jailed or anything, but I think why that could be useful is it could be a sort of statement of intent of the government that this is behavior that you shouldn't be doing, and even if no one was ever actually prosecuted for it, just a way of kind of making it clear what behavior should be.
Surprisingly,
Which I mean, that laws like that exist in many Muslim countries to very varied amounts of enforcement. To countries where it's basically completely unenforced like that, and to countries where it's very strongly enforced.
yeah, surprisingly, in my state in the United States, we actually have an adultery law in the books. Um, Adultery is still punishable by a $10 fine. I'm not sure how
Um,
I'm not sure how strongly enforced it is, but it does raise questions for me because the general conception is that we have reached kind of progressive clown world, and yet in many ways we do have these laws that like if someone were to ask me point blank, do I think adultery should be outlawed? I mean, it's tough. I agree. I think some of the reasons you gave I could agree with, getting like outlawing adultery. Um and yet what it allows is, and I think the way it's used in my state right now, is a way to make divorce more possible. So like the way adultery is used is, it as a crime, is that by showing that this person committed a crime against the other person, adultery, it's used as a way to justify uh, divorce. And so I think that's kind of the unintended consequence of using laws to impart morals or values as opposed to recognizing that that's not the government's role. The government's role is, in a sense, to protect rights.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know much about that specific instance, um, how that works. I mean, ideally, I would want the government's conception of marriage to be identical to the church's conception of marriage, so completely insoluble. Um, but um, but yeah, I can't really say anything specific about how that works, and maybe in your state, I would support getting rid of that adultery law if it would make divorce more difficult. Um, but uh, but yeah, I suppose this is kind of getting away from sort of the main topic. So trying to push it back a bit closer to that. Um, the sort of my issue with this focus on liberalism is it's the I can't remember if I mentioned this example in our Twitter conversation at all or not. Um, but are you familiar with the stories about how Gandhi would and I don't even know if this is true. I think it's true, but it doesn't really matter. The principle is what matters, not whether or not this is a true historical account. Is that apparently Gandhi would sleep naked with young women to test himself. Um, are you familiar with those stories?
Yeah, I've heard about them. I don't know if they're true or not, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But that the reason I bring that up, I know it probably sounds pretty strange, but the reason I bring it up is I feel like the sort of conception of liberalism that you're putting forward is somewhat principally aligned with that. And what I mean by that is in any state, there's always, whether it's a hyper authoritarian state or a hyper libertarian state, there's always going to be some degree of autonomy for citizens to commit acts of virtue and to commit acts of vice. Um, and the idea of the sort of Christian idea of the libertarian state that that allows maximum liberty to allow people to hopefully express maximum allows maximum liberty to allow people to hopefully express maximum virtue. I kind of feel like it's a similar principle to that. Gandhi sleeping with these women, saying, I mean, if he wants to show just how chaste he can possibly be, the way to prove that the most is to show that he can sleep with young women and not do anything about it. Where, like, yes, I suppose you could say someone that has access to unlimited internet pornography, they're a more chaste person than someone who's lived in a convent their whole life and sexual acts were, other than masturbation was never really even an option for them. But I don't see why we shouldn't, as a society, both governmentally and through social pressure, try and create situations where maximum virtue is able to be expressed by trying to push people towards both governmentally and socially the virtuous path and away from the path of vice. Sorry, I know it's quite rambling, but hopefully you got what I was trying to get.
No, it's not rambling at all. And I mean, I think your analogy does hit upon a certain way my argument can be presented, which is, liberalism as a test in a sense. Like, we're gonna Chesterton's fence is this, great metaphor as well. The idea that the children are able to play more freely if you build a fence to keep them safe. Take down the fence, and they're all kind of scared of falling off the cliff or something like that. And so liberalism is like taking down Chesterton's fence. In a sense, yes, it allows the greatest possibility for virtue and heroism, but, and some might say the historical record seems to suggest, it also allows for vice, and perhaps as vices become socially sanctioned, it makes virtue more difficult. Is that kind of what you were getting at with that metaphor?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think there's a certain truth to that, and I mean, it's hard to get around around the fact that a lot of the propaganda that the left, the progressives, the cathedral uses, is cloaked in the same rights language I would use as a liberal. Abortion is defended as my body, my choice. We might say the people who commit abortion are wrong because it's not their body, but the fact is they're using that language. Um, but for me, I don't I don't think it should be viewed as a test. I guess the way I conceptually understand it is that, yeah, if you talk about maximum liberty in the same way a libertarian talks about maximum liberty, kind of this anarchic, anarcho-capitalist kind of hellscape, yeah, you start running into the contradictions that I mean we have in society today, and that we can extrapolate further. In a sense, maximum license uh, is not an example of liberal government. I would say maximum license at the end of the day means no government. Um, so, what I would say is that for liberalism to, I mean, what what I understand liberalism to be saying is that it's defending freedom, but it's freedom understood really in reference to human nature. Um, you know, Aristotle's example of the best flute should go to the best flautist, gives us the idea of different things have different essences, and what is good for one person is not good for another. What is good for one species is not good for another species, and so liberalism really lives or dies with the idea of human beings as rational animals, as creatures that have choice, creatures that, in a sense, were created to be like God, being able to be good, um, but also unlike God in the fact that goodness is we are not goodness in the same way God is. We have to choose goodness. We have to choose God Himself in order to participate in that essence. And insofar as that understanding of human beings is accepted, the the there is a necessity for the political order to protect that. Was that
I'm
clear?
sorry.
Was that
Yeah, yes, I got to what you're trying to say. Um, yeah, I suppose coming my main issue with this line of argumentation, um, is it's is no society or no set of laws or nothing that I would try to propose would take away anyone's right to, um, in a broad sense, nothing would take away a person's right to choose vice or to choose sin or anything like that. People, there's no set of laws I could possibly try to enforce that would make it impossible for people to choose lust or to choose gluttony or anything like that. But I do think that it would be possible to enforce a certain set of laws which would uh, which would make it discourage people from choosing lust and encourage people to choose chastity, discourage people from choosing gluttony, and encouraging people to choose temperance. For example, I remember this feels like a betrayal of my much younger conservative days when I was outraged by New York's large soda ban. But now I'm starting to think that type of policy sounds like it might actually make some sort of sense. Um, it's not. It certainly isn't. Preventing anyone from having large sodas. If they want to order a bunch of sodas, they can. Um, but having certain health laws that discourage people from neglecting themselves, I think, is possibly a good thing. Having certain laws that discourage people from committing deviant sexual acts, even that to outlaw it, that doesn't prevent them, because you might have a law that says death penalty for everyone that has sex outside of marriage in non-procreative ways. And of course, I wouldn't support that. But just for example, you could have that law, but you wouldn't stop people. People would still do it. People would still commit sexual sin. There's no way you can you can try to discourage them as much as you want, but people still get to make that choice at the end of the day, no matter how strict your the societal and governmental enforcement is.
No, I agree. That's true, but there's there's the sense that if we accept that understanding of the government, what are we saying about the government? It seems to me that what we're saying is that the government has some role um in really defining what goodness means to the people, what morality means to the people. And
Yeah, I absolutely, I would agree with that statement 100%.
and then the question is, what is the government for uh to have that role? What do we mean by government when we say government helps tell the people what is good? Uh from my background, government becomes the really what we understand is the government is the sanctioned use of force. And I know that sounds kind of libertarian-esque to people, but there is this sense that, I mean, how do you know what the government is in your country, your city, whatever? I mean, you pay taxes to the government. Why do you pay taxes to the government and not some local gang? Well, the reason is that the government can enforce those taxes, and the government uses force against the gang, yes, to protect you, but also to protect its own investments in collecting those taxes. Um, we obey the government and its laws because it is the use of force. And there's something that's frightening for me when we say that this entity, which is defined by the sanctioned use of force, the essentially the biggest bully on the block, is also being charged with the task of defining morality.
Yes, I understand why you have that concern. Um, and I would agree that liberalism and secularism are useful tactics in multicultural, multi-religious societies. Um, but I'd consider them only that, tactics. The difference between the society I want and the society I don't want is that the society I want, the good is defined by Catholicism, and the society I don't want, it's defined by atheism or Islam or something like that. I agree with you completely that the defining aspect of government is the monopoly on the use of force. But there's no escaping that, and there doesn't appear to be any escaping the government's monopoly on power. So and we have these leftists that constantly tell us that they want to prescribe morality. They don't want to prescribe morality. But I mean, we should know that they're lying when they say that. They literally want to take your kids away from you if you don't want to chemically castrate them. The it does. I think it does kind of just come down to what I believe to be the fact that that human society is sort of a Hobbesian power struggle, and it's just it comes down to who can wield the biggest stick, and I just hope we can make sure that's our guys and not their guys.
So I mean that is true. If we could somehow, I mean, if you had an example where you had a Catholic majority state, but also Catholic majority where the Catholics are all of one mind, at least on some of the major issues that we agree with. Um, and these Catholics could rule justly, and you know, not necessarily elect, but pick a government that we know won't be corrupted by that power, then yes, I mean, in that case, we could say, well, yeah, why not have a government that that represents the people in their Catholicity. The problem is that maybe there was a time when this wasn't true, although I'm not sure. But we live in a society of multicultural states. The the ethnostatist will say that that's exactly the problem, and so what we need to do is get back to having a Catholic state, having a single cultural unit that's able to fully apply the laws um, of that moral system that comes with that people or that religion or whatever. Um, but I think we would both agree that the steps it would take to make that a reality, um, would bring back the horrors of the 20th century. So, in a sense, we need to conform our political expectations and our political ideals to the reality of multicultural systems, multicultural political orders.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with that. Um, I yeah, I mean, like I said, I think uh, liberalism is an effective tactic for these states that we have to live in for the time being, at least. Um, I suppose I hold out some hope that like 500 years from now, Canada can be full of based Chinese Christians or something like that. But I know for the time being that it isn't going to be like that. Um, but uh, uh, but um, but yeah, I mean, I don't really disagree with what you said. I suppose I just disagree with the end goal.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you bring up that you think liberalism is an effective tactic, but what's interesting about it is that a lot of traditionalists will say, well, liberalism is fragile. It's so
I'd say I would give the qualifier can be an effective tactic, not necessarily is.
okay. I mean, that's fair. But would you say you would agree with a lot of people on the kind of dissident right traditionalist perspective that liberalism is susceptible to subversion, which is which seems to be the an objection I come across a lot. And when we discuss the topic of this talk, can liberalism survive itself? That seems to be where a lot of the concern, you know, the people who would say no, liberalism cannot survive itself, would say that because they believe that liberalism invites its own, it invites its own conquerors. Liberalism allows for the degeneracy that degenerates a moral people into an immoral people. Is that kind of like the concern you're?
Yeah, more or less. I uh, yeah, I would pretty much agree with that. The um, sorry.
So I find it interesting that you bring out that liberalism can be an effective tactic.
Yes, sorry. What I wanted to say there, my mind just went totally blank. Um, would be that it can be an effective tactic, and there are certain issues that we face where using liberalism is probably the sort of argument for liberalism, like the sort of free speech arguments that we have, which I do like free speech quite a bit, and I do think that it's a goal that we should strive for. That isn't just a tactical view. But there are certain things that there are certain fights that we have where I think we should use liberalism, but for the most part, we're not. No one anywhere close to us are in the controlling seat of liberalism currently. It's being used almost completely by people that would be our enemies on all the important issues to destroy the things that we think are good currently.
Yeah, but couldn't we? I mean, is that an issue of liberalism itself, or is it an issue of, signs of the time sounds way too abstract for what we're saying here, but is it a generational problem? I mean, would the boomers still be boomers if we suddenly got transported into, I don't know, a perfect Catholic monarchy? Um, we'd still have to deal with the issue that the boomers, or fill in whatever group you want to, would still be an interest group that would be vying for power. The way they do it might be different, but um, whether I mean I don't know if the boomers would support regicide, but they might support, bec- becoming influencers in the kingdom in some way or another, becoming lords of the king in some way, um, or at least counseling the lords.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, you're taking it to a place that's a bit too abstract.
Yeah,
I'm just having a hard time understanding, uh, how exactly this is applicable to what exactly we're dealing with.
yeah. Sorry. Probably. I went too far with the imagery, but I guess what I'm saying is, when you raise that, one of the issues with liberalism is that, um, we the dissident right who would use liberalism correctly, um, aren't in the seats of power. Um, the concern I'm responding is, wouldn't that be true even if we were not in a liberal state? Like
Uh,
like in the chat, Lassaman says groups will always use the state for their own ends. Groups that don't will be replaced by groups that do. Isn't that? I mean, that's true of any state, not just liberal states.
yeah, I agree. I mean, my problem with modernity, my problem with modern liberalism isn't the absurd pensions and social security and Medicare and stuff that boomers have. I mean, that's bad, but that's not really my main issue. My main issue is the sort of social degeneracy that we're all familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I, um, I'm not, I'm not particularly concerned about how well boomers would be able to defend their pensions in like the Catholic state. Um, but yeah, uh, I'm still honestly having troubles conceptualizing the stuff you're describing.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is, the social degeneracy you know you object to. Um, I mean, is it a problem of liberalism, or is it a problem of the people in power in kind of the West that we have now? Um, in other words, if you were if you were to imagine the West as it is now, but we just suddenly switched into a different illiberal government. I mean, we would still have the same people in power, uh, the same political interests, and therefore the same goals, to spread, degeneracy. Uh, you know, what's
Yeah, I mean, I guess I agree. If what you're saying is the goal, the main goal, it doesn't matter less so. Um, on like a reactionary model of government or a democratic model of government, the main like short-term goal should be unseating the unseating the people that are currently in power and replacing them with people that can be and it doesn't like if we we could have a highly reactionary form of government right now in America or Canada or something, but that wouldn't do us any good. That would just make the I suppose from like the NRX perspective, the only good that would do is it would make the power structures more clear, um, uh, where exactly the power is actually held. But beyond that, that wouldn't make it any more accountable to us than it currently is.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's kind of the advantage of liberalism is that, yeah, like you pointed out, does it obscure the power structure in some way? Perhaps, but it all the obscure power structure um, means that unlike a divine right kingship where the state itself has some kind of investment in in the governing ruling class, in a liberal state, you know, the American Republic, the British political system, constitutional monarchy, uh, we can replace the heads of state. I mean, we can't replace the British Queen without really causing some serious issues in the British conception of themselves. But prime ministers change, governments change all the time, um, and yeah, from the NRX perspective, you really haven't changed the governing class there, but there is some sense in which you repeat the cycles enough time. If we get involved and participate in the political process, you can actually start chipping away at the cathedral. Um, and that's why I think there is a sense that the United States is, despite the fact that it's in many ways the epicenter of the cathedral, kind of being the cultural hegemon that it is, it's much more resistant than the EU states have been to some of the worst parts of kind of the progressive program. Um, you brought up the example of, like, they'll take your kids away from you. Um, I mean, maybe it's happened in the US, but it seems like all the examples of it happen in the UK. Not just the UK, but kind of the whole EU kind of superstructure. I feel like I rambled there for a little bit. Did I obscure more than I clarified, or?
No, I think I mostly understood what you were getting at. I mean, I think the uh, yes, I mean the sort of main case I was referring to was the case in Texas, which we did win slightly. But the fact that we were just slightly able to stop we were just slightly able to stop the chemical castration of a kid in what's supposed to be one of the most conservative states. I don't consider that much of a victory. But I mean, we do have much bigger reactions against the sort of system in Europe than we do in America, in continental Europe at least. I mean, for example, Salvini is the most right wing politician in Western Europe, and he is currently out of government, but he currently looks poised to sweep the elections if they happen anytime soon. And similarly, they have many parties throughout Europe that are relatively successful. And I think that mostly comes down to just differences in electoral laws. Proportional representation in particular just makes it easier for parties that can get in there and that can have really distant views. And since Canada, the U.S., the U.K., the electoral systems we have just make it more difficult for dissident views to get any spotlight, and that's why we haven't had parties that really challenge the status quo much. Trump has been fine for what he is, but he's that's I don't think that's saying a great deal.
No, I agree. You know, I still back Trump as kind of the best of the the best
Yeah, I mean, I'd
the
definitely vote for him if I was an American.
yeah, the best that we can expect from the situation we have. But yeah, he's been kind of a disappointment. But you raise a good point. That the electoral systems in Italy, and other EU countries, proportional representation do allow for dissident voices to get in. Um, and I mean, is that something that, in a sense, shows the anti-fragility of liberalism? That even even if yes, it can be, even if yet yes, there are examples of lib- where liberalism has been subverted, that it allows for perhaps some of the vice that we've seen, with the whole progressive movement, the whole cathedral and everything. The anti fragility of it is that it has allowed for the reaction to kind of strike back. Like, the reason the cathedral doesn't crack down on us is that they are accountable in some way to public opinion, and public opinion is, you know, protects kind of the dissidents because it has accepted things like freedom of speech, some kind of recognition that everyone deserves to be in the public square. And now these are kind of caricatures of liberalism in a certain way, um, in the sense that it ascribes what should be a political principle to a moral principle. But even in caricature, it's something that um, has allowed perhaps the best elements of liberalism to shine forth.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd say the biggest reactions are liberal systems being grafted onto states and societies that they weren't quite made for. Like the most right wing groups in Europe, the most right wing groups that are also the most successful right wing groups. I don't care about some perfect, Catholic party that wants to return us all to the 1400s if they can only get 5 people to vote for them.
Right.
But so the most successful, most right wing groups, like Salvini, or law and justice in Poland, I think they're mainly a result of those two things, of proportional representation and of proportional representation being grafted onto societies that don't have quite the liberal history that that liberal countries do. I mean, for example, Poland's experiment with liberalism is very young, and I think that explains quite a bit why they're as right wing as they are, and even Italy too. They they have they of course had the fascist period, and they did have a relatively liberal constitutional monarchy prior to that. But that wasn't that long that they had that sort of government, compared to countries that have a much longer history of that, like the UK or France. So yeah, yeah, I don't think these sorts of reactions against the sort of status quo that we see are really a result of liberalism itself. It's more kind of liberalism being grafted onto states that weren't quite prepared for it as well as our more Western states have been.
Mm-hmm. So do you think the reaction, I mean, like the right wing movements that have erupted in Poland and the Lega Nord in Italy, is that, I mean, do you see that as a reaction to liberalism in totality, or is it, kind of just the globalist, kind of the reaction to kind of the globalist left wing?
Yeah, mainly just the latter. I mean, it is black pilling in a sense that for the most part, the our great movements are essentially liberal to the core in a lot of ways. I mean, especially this is the case when you're talking about groups like UKIP, which but even when it comes to Salvini or Law and Justice, they are still fundamentally working within a liberal framework.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, I'm not sure. I guess my question is then why do you think the fact that liberalism was put on these countries not too long ago, um, why do you think that that's the reason why these are the countries that are having these reactionary movements? Um, because if it's not that they're reacting to liberalism itself, then in a sense, why would the fact that liberalism is kind of newer there than it is in England or France or the UK? Why would that affect it?
Well, I mean, the state of liberalism in these places is very different. Because, I mean, if liberalism meant if liberalism meant like 1850s liberalism, then I wouldn't have much of a problem with liberalism. My problem with liberalism is that it seems like there is my problem with liberalism is the fear that 1850s liberalism will necessarily lead to current year liberalism.
Okay.
Um, so the sort of so it is Lega or Law and Justice as two concrete examples. Um, they are still fundamentally liberal parties in a lot of ways. Though there are certain ways that they kind of break that mold, but for the most part, they're definitely fundamentally liberal. But the sort of liberalism that they that they show is very different from the liberalism that we're familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could
So
you?
it mostly just seems like they're 100 years back on the train of progress.
Okay. Um. Yeah. So I mean, you don't have an issue with like 1850s liberalism, but like you said, the fear is 1850s liberalism becomes 2050s liberalism. Um.
Yeah.
And I think that that kind of reaches like kind of at the core of this debate is that you mentioned that does liberalism necessarily do that? Are the window shifts or kind of not a bug but a feature of liberalism? And I'd say to be able to establish that, you'd have to show what it is in liberalism that does this. Like you'd actually have to go into the code, you know, analogy to a computer program here, to show that this is coded into liberalism. For me, it seems much more clear that it's the issue is not liberalism itself, but kind of the parentage of liberalism. Um, and I mentioned this in my in my video where I my where I stand video, where I said that I really think it's the parentage of liberalism here. It's the fact that liberalism was unfortunately born out of the Reformation and the Enlightenment, which were, we never, we never think about Europe as having had a civil war, but really, in many ways, I think the Reformation represents kind of the European Civil War. Um, and I think just the the psychological trauma of the Reformation created a liberalism that became materialistic, atheistic, um, and frank, kind of rejecting of authority. And if you could somehow uh, rescue liberalism from that parentage, if if you could have a liberalism, if you could have a liberalism, um, that was kind of divorced uh, from that
Where
parentage.
like the founding fathers were all traditional Catholics instead of like Masonic deists.
Right. And I guess I'd say that's kind of where I differ with a lot of traditionalists is that, um, in a sense, for me, the traditional project is to kind of uh, to kind of baptize liberalism. Um, we can't change history, but we can mold the future, by by being politically active and um, socially active in the present, to create kind of a refounding of America. Doesn't necessarily have to be America. It could be the EU, but the same basic idea is that liberalism is the progression. Um, it it just got a false start.
Um, yeah, I see what you're getting at, and I to use that analogy that I made, like liberalism that was started by traditional Catholics. I'm not quite sure if there is a state that where you could say that was there was a liberal state where that were their founding fathers, traditional Catholics that wanted a liberal but still Catholic oriented society. Um, I mean I know in Italy's case, which I'm not massively familiar with the history, but I have at least a broad knowledge of. It was a quite similar group to the American founding fathers, sort of Protestants and deists and Masons and that type of people that were in charge, that were um, much of the founding fathers of a state that was, even though the vast majority of the population was Catholic. Garibaldi, in particular, is generally believed to be Protestant. That's not incredibly clear. He's one of the most famous founding fathers of Italy, of the Italian state.
Yeah,
Um,
interesting fact about Garibaldi, that a lot of people don't know is, Abraham Lincoln wanted Garibaldi to be the general of the Union armies during the American Civil War.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah, Garibaldi refused because Garibaldi said, "I'll only do it if you free the slaves in the North." And at the time, Abraham Lincoln wasn't prepared to do that.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. But no, yeah. So I'm unaware of a sort of traditional Catholic founded society, liberal society. So I'm not sure if we have any real world test cases of this. Um, but I suppose what I believe or what I fear is the case with liberalism, um, is that it kind of comes back to Robert Conquest's third law. I believe it's his third law, that all institutions that are not conservative, that are not explicitly conservative, will over time become liberal. Where sort of just taking a broad view of the way Western civilization has progressed over the past 500 approximately years, um, it, uh, it's that's one of the reasons that I'm a former evangelical, and a convert to Catholicism.
Oh,
Um,
when did you convert?
I'm actually still in the process, but
Okay.
yeah.
Well,
So
congrats.
relatively recently, I'm in RCIA right now. Um, but I made my mind up, so I identify as a Catholic. Um, but But yes, so one of the things that sort of black pilled me about Protestantism is it sort of seemed like Protestantism of all its many forms, which I became quite familiar with, um, sort of gave in to Robert Conquest's third law, that they were by their very nature not constitutionally conservative, and Catholicism, and to a lesser extent Orthodoxy, were the only forms of Christianity that were constitutionally conservative, in a broad sense. Um, and similarly, I'm not sure if it's necessarily possible to create a constitutionally conservative liberal state. If it is, if there is some way to sort of create strong structures in a liberal state that would um, prevent the sort of subversion that we've seen, then that perhaps could be a good state. Um, but the sort of fear that I have is that the liberal state, by its own very nature, is it leads to progressivism, and that it's sort of impossible to create a state that we at least would view as liberal that isn't going to sort of go down the same pipeline that we've already been down.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think like mentioning Robert Conquest's third law, I think that's a helpful framing because put in that sense, yeah, do liberal states go down this path? I think Conquest would say them just like any state uh would, and that's what I think the liberal response is saying, yeah, that's true of liberal states, but is it more true of liberal states than it is of um illiberal states? And I don't think that's the case, because even if you have something that's constitutionally conservative, you gave the example of the Catholic Church, but even in the Catholic Church, there are power groups that exist, that have pushed kind of progressive narratives. We saw this with the Amazonian Synod. Um, so I don't think this is a thing, an issue about liberalism. Um, does liberalism give more weapons to kind of the progressives, the cathedral? Yeah, but it also, as we pointed out, gives the more weapons to the reaction. Um, in a sense, the reaction feeds on feeds on liberalism and allows them to dig the trenches a little more firm. Um, kind of. Are you familiar with Tolkien's Long Defeat?
No.
Okay. So in a famous essay, and he's used this theme in his books, but J.R.R. Tolkien writes, history is a long defeat. It's the continual idea that we're fighting for the present to hold off the darkness for another day, knowing that by our own power we can never do it, and ultimately Christ is the one who will vanquish the darkness forever. But in a sense, we're just holding the line. Um, as as hard as we can, knowing that we will, you know, in the temporal sense, we will always be defeated, but in the eternal sense, we will, and in some, and in an eternal way of speaking, we already have won through Christ. Um, and I guess for me, the reality, it's in that context that I say, liberalism gives us the weapons to slow down this long defeat. Um, yeah, it sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. Um, yeah, in some ways that you pointed out in this conversation, it does give ammunition to kind of progressive or left wing interest groups, but those same weapons are given to us.
Yeah, yeah. I see what you're saying. Um, And I think this is kind of the sort of fundamental difference of opinion. Um, but is that I'm very mistrustful of whether or not we can prevent the sort of problems that we have today um, in a liberal framework in the long term. In the short term, a liberal framework is all we really have, um, and I don't think there's much. That it really annoys me, these like purity spiraling integralists that you'll have on Twitter saying that you must support absolutist monarchy only, and if you support anything else, then you're just a cuck or whatever. Um, Obviously, there's a certain framework we have to work within the short term, but the but it is my issue is more, how would we if we were able to sort of pull ourselves away from the precipice, how would we prevent a society from reaching the point we have today again in the future? And I think the sort of fundamental difference of opinion is, I'm uncertain that that could be accomplished within a liberal framework, and that I would want I would want fundamentally constitutionally conservative aspects of a state to prevent that from to try to prevent that from happening. And I understand and agree with what you're saying, that it's sort of always a battle, and that it's something that generation after generation we just need to fight against. Uh, but I think there's other models of government, other formations of society that could make that battle go better in the future. And again, I mean, it's there's of course some limit of usefulness um, in using analogies from between churches and the state, um, though, and the Catholic Church certainly does have its problems, but it's nothing like the problems Protestants have. I mean, like the progressives in the Catholic Church are arguing for things like saying contraception's okay, or female priests or whatever, and that's all bad, of course. But like virtually all conservative, quote unquote, Protestants say that contraception's okay, or say that even female pastors are okay. I've found most conservative, nominally conservative Protestants are okay with. So the sort of things we're fighting over, the Overton window is very different among the Catholics than it is among the Protestants, and I think, of course, that fundamentally comes back to God's protection of His Church. But I think that also is a result of the structures that He gave the Church that made it easier to defend than the structures that was given to Protestant churches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's a fair point. But going back to your point about like what would we do differently if if we do get this chance to baptize liberalism, to kind of reform what was done previously, and I'd say the big one is the I mentioned the problems with the Reformation previously, but the problem with the other parent of liberalism, the other you know um the other parent of liberalism, is the Enlightenment, specifically kind of the scientism that came out of it, the idea that the only things that matter, the only things that really exist, are those things that can be scientifically measured. And I think it's from that we got the emphasis on materialism. And the emphasis on materialism from a scientific perspective became kind of the emphasis on materialism in kind of the moral perspective, where people became and in a sense, you could argue that liberalism allowed this focus on material wealth as a sign of a good life. And from that, you got many of the problems of liberalism today. Individualism. We don't invest in our communities. We invest in ourselves because we want to have a good life. And how do you know you had a good life? Well, you die with the most stuff. So in kind of this reform, the what would we do to reform liberalism, um, refound it, and how do we move forward from this point? I think that's kind of the enemy, kind of the first dragon we have to slay. We have to get people to realize that there's more to life than stuff. And I see this especially living in an kind of urban environment, where I mean, it's obviously something that affects our entire culture, but especially in the big cities in the United States, and I presume it's similar in Canada, the emphasis on materiality, just just as a status symbol, um, you know, among the working class, but even among the higher classes as well. Um, driving the big cars, having the biggest TVs. Like, if we can defeat that, that's what I would say is kind of the first dragon to slay. Um, to get to kind of separate liberalism from its parentage, and to refound it in a way that um, it allows for maximum freedom and maximum virtue.
Yeah, I think I understand most of what you're saying. Um, I honestly, I think at this point we've mostly gotten our differences out there, and I don't think there's much more for me to say.
Sure. No, totally agree. Um, are there any more questions from the chat? I know chat's kind of been quiet for a while, but and I mean, if no one else has posted anything, was there anything you wanted to say, or
No, not in particular.
okay?
I mean, I guess I'd like to ask everyone to check out my channel and subscribe.
Yeah, definitely. Settler has a YouTube channel, Settler's Lament. And I haven't, just because of the issues we had with the new software, I wasn't able to put in the description yet. But I'll make sure I do that. But if you just look up Settler's Lament on YouTube, you'll be able to find it easily. And what I'll also do is also kind of upload a video where I cut out the beginning where we were struggling uh, with stuff, with the encoder and everything, in order to kind of make this easier to watch. Um, but thank you so much for coming on, and I hope you'd be willing to come on again. For a cleaner video.
Yeah, of course. Thanks. I think despite the technical problems, it was a good discussion.
Yeah, definitely. All right.
So yeah, thanks everyone, and bye.
And I'm Benedict the 17th. Go with God.